So today I have with me Dr. Ana Aliverti from the University of Warwick to talk about some of her recent research that she's been doing for the last couple of years with police and immigration enforcement in the UK. So Anna, can you just tell me a little bit about the sort of big projects that you've been running and then turn to some of your key findings?
Thank you, Mary. Yes, so my work was, originally during my PhD was very much focused on questions of criminalization and then looking at court proceedings, particularly in relation to how migration administrative breaches have been increasingly criminalized and how that process kind of plays out in actual court proceedings. And then I conducted a project on criminal courts looking at how questions of migration status and citizenship impact on decisions, criminal justice decisions. So in terms of bail decisions, sentencing decisions, and for instance, the figure of the interpreter as a key figure in these hearings and the effect of the presence of interpreters. And then from there, while I was working in the courts, I became increasingly interested in exploring processes of enforcement prior to cases getting into the courts. So I became very interested around 2011, 2012 on a specific Operation Nexus that was a joint operation between the police and immigration enforcement, in which immigration enforcement, so immigration officers, inland immigration officers, were stationed in police custody to identify foreign nationals arrested by the police to kind of what they say fix identities, check what kind of immigration traces they have in immigration system, and then assess whether they can remove them from the UK. So virtually they were functioning as actors in the criminal justice process to root people out of the criminal justice process and kind of operationalizing immigration removal as an alternative way to deal with people. So this is very much how my current project on policing and immigration enforcement started. So I kind of work first with the police and immigration officers stationed in police stations, and then in police custody, I shadow immigration officers for some time, and then I also did quite a lot of work with immigration officers in operational visits, what they call enforcement visits, to check on particular individuals, to arrest them, and some of those visits were done as well with the police.
Can you explain to me how it works if somebody is brought in to the police station, either by the police or by an immigration enforcement team working with the police, and they're suspected of something which is both an immigration violation and a criminal justice and a criminal offence, how do they decide whether to push somebody through the immigration route or whether to actually arrest them and put them through the criminal route? Because there are offences which fall under both systems. So how do they make that decision?
So it's very much a case-by-case scenario. So that this is one of the very, you know, kind of difficult aspect of the project, because or actually a finding of the project, because I found that there's quite a lot of discretion in it when, you know, when the two systems, you know, the criminal justice system and the immigration system interacts, that leaves a lot of discretion to the officers, frontline officers who are in charge of making decisions. And you know, one of the points that I'm very interested in exploring, and I explore in the book that I'm finalizing on this topic, is that, you know, at the end of the day, the decision on an individual very much relies on aspects that have nothing to do with the case itself, with the offense itself. It has to do with, you know, as you know, because of your research in detention, it has to be do with logistical issues. If there is bed space, if there is a charter flight bound to the home country at a particular time. And so all these considerations that are, you know, I'm not saying that they are absent in the criminal justice spheres, but that they play a minor role in the immigration sphere, are completely central.
Okay. That's interesting. And I know at the beginning of this sort of intersection between immigration control and criminal justice systems, academic research quite often argued that the criminal justice actors were not always comfortable with their new role in the immigration system, that they often found the Home Office difficult to work with, that there were sometimes sort of concerns about, you know, the Home Office trumping the criminal justice sort of principles. Did you find that with your work with the police, or by the time you were doing your research, you know, were the police, had they already become accustomed to this new set of responsibilities and relationships that are being forged?
What I found is that there's a huge variation in relation to police views and perceptions of immigration. On the other hand, and that has to do with the, you know, highly controversial nature of immigration enforcement. So on the other hand, you have a lot of frontline staff that find immigration what they call a dark art. So very obscure, very difficult to navigate, very different from how the police works, the rules of the police. You know, you have the police work with a very regulated framework, whereas in immigration that framework is almost non-existent in terms of procedure. And so you have police officers, and particularly in custody, that find immigration really, really disconcerting, really difficult to grasp, difficult to understand. On the other hand, you have frontline staff, so officers who, constables, that find immigration very frustrating because of the issues I mentioned briefly before, because it works, the rules and the criteria for decision making and for outcomes are very sometimes random, are arbitrary, or at least this is how they perceive them, and they arrest someone and then they find out that they have to release the person because the rules have changed, or there is a case that completely changed the way in which immigration works and the rules, etc., etc. And on the other hand, you have I think like a niche of police officers who are really very keen on working with immigration officers, and really keen on incorporating deportation as a tool, as a policing tool, as a crime reduction tool. And they work very much out of initiatives, right? And this is what I call DIY policing. They work out of, informal contacts and without much institutional support, and they resent this. But these officers conceive immigration as a great tool, as a great, policing tool, and this is, and I call what they call the magic of immigration. I explore that concept, which seems, a metaphor to say that, immigration kind of can solve policing problems by deporting someone, right? So I explored the concept of magic, which is recurrently used by these police officers in their work to refer to immigration, and to explore what that might tell us about the work they do.
That's so interesting. Does your work also go the other way? Like, have you witnessed whether police culture is affecting immigration enforcement practices, or rather how immigration enforcement agents view the police, and are those views also in flux? Because as criminologists, we tend to focus on the criminal justice agents and how they're affected by immigration, but you've done both sides.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, because so immigration officers have a very ambivalent relationship with the police, and so on the other hand, they present themselves as the foreigners' police, right? They kind of, when they explain their role to friends, to even the people they deal with, they talk about them being the police for the foreigners, right? And so they draw these parallels between the police and immigration, in the same way that detention staff draw that parallels between detention and prison. So the criminal justice is very much a point of reference, a comparator, a way of making sense of an institution which is relatively new, which is relatively unknown, and there are a number of similarities with what some criminologists call policing culture, police culture. I found a lot of parallels in terms of questions of what the how they conceive their role, how what aspects of their role attract them, how they relate to communities, to their patches. But also there are a range of very important distinctions between the how they perceive themselves. One of the most important distinctions is this idea of, and this perception of what they do as being very morally contentious, socially contentious, and politically, you know, a very sensitive issue. And that kind of shapes very much how they see themselves as officers, how they present themselves. So one of the questions that I asked them in interviews, I conducted interviews with around 50 officers at different ranks. And one of the questions that I asked, and the question that really was the most interesting one to listen their views. And one of the very recurrent themes in their response is that they don't reveal that they are immigration officers to close friends and family members. They feel they feel anxiety about exposing themselves to different, you know, to different reactions, positive reactions, or, you know, from pro border control sections of society, but also negative reactions by anti border control sections of society. So that is very interesting, and it tells a lot about you know, the very difficult conditions that they that their job is framed within.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, I mean, as we've discussed already, or the video, is that I mean, that's a constant finding. That's been a constant finding in my work with detention custody officers, and it's also a finding in my current work with the deportation agents. And I mean, I think I always am vaguely amused about with the private sector employees who I talk to, is that if they say anything about their job, they quite often either just say something general like, oh, I work at Heathrow, so you know, I work at the airport, or sometimes they say they work for the Home Office. so they sometimes kind of, and I think they do that partly because, you know, I guess maybe the idea for British citizens would be that if you say you work for the Home Office, that's a huge organization and no one really knows what that's about. And equally, the airport has lots of different jobs, and so no one really knows what that could be either. But I was very interested in reading some of your work to see that immigration enforcement say the same sorts of things and have the same kinds of anxieties, because I do think that tells us a lot about the politicized nature of border control. And on one level, I kind of think it's a place where actually critical work could be done to try and sort of, you know, amplify those concerns and encourage people to think more about why they have those anxieties. So
just one thing about what you were saying about the immigration detention stuff. So in part, some of the immigration officers I interview also present themselves as you know, working in the passport, in passport placement. Well, not only because that's kind of the immediate connections people make, you know, the border force TV program. So immigration officers are at the border, so the border is very much, you know, a place of a site of identification of their work, although in my work, I showed that that's a very limited view of what immigration border controls is about. But also because it's very sanitized, right? So sitting at the border, taking passports is a very sanitized job description of what they do, and doesn't kind of invite uncomfortable questions about what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, so they explained to me that they reply in that way because they don't want to create a controversy out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's so interesting. I mean, I do think we need to probably also be a bit careful. Like on the one hand, I think, oh, this is fascinating. We should go into much more detail and see the sort of lack of legitimacy, or see these kinds of comments as a profound sign of the kind of lack of legitimacy of many practices. On the other hand, I also think sometimes that, especially for us, I guess, coming from a profession where we, struggle probably to differentiate our sense of who we are from what we do, so that our job is actually very important to who we are, who we think we are as people. I sometimes think that might lead us down a path of over-interpolating what people say, because actually I think lots of people who just work, and then they don't necessarily absorb that as beyond a kind of 9-to-5 job or whatever. So some of the deflection, some of these sorts of easy things people say to characterize their work, maybe to avoid controversy, but they may be wanting to avoid controversy just because they also can't be asked to have those sorts of difficult conversations because they don't feel that connected to their job. Whereas, if somebody wants to have a long conversation with me about what's the utility of university, or what's the point of getting a degree or whatever, like I'll be up for that argument, because it's actually quite important to me. So I think in my own work, I've been trying to read things on the sociology of work and on labor and on in that sort of area, to try and get a slightly broader perspective about whether are these accounts of what it's like to have a job, are they peculiar and particular to border enforcement related work, or is this just a characteristic of a lot of people's experiences of their job? Mm-hmm. But I don't know the answer to that, but that's
Yes, I think that is true. It is also true that it's a very subtle kind of description of or representation of professional identity, because I also think that in that presentation, okay, it's just a job, it's just a job. This is neither good or bad. It's just a job for me. In some of those responses, I think there is a bit of a recognition that or recognition, or at least attempt to iron out the emotional and moral and political dimensions of a job that is always present. Mm-hmm. So for example, when I was exploring the how they emotionally cope with their work, which sometimes involve arresting people, and arresting very frail people, arresting families, arresting terminally ill people. Some officers mention examples of these circumstances, or even arresting someone that that doesn't, you wouldn't frame as a in this context, this is a very stressful job, and it's a job that raise a huge amount of moral dilemmas in a way that I don't think other law enforcement job does. And I found that also immigration officers, when they make reference to that dimension of their role, they immediately try to kind of iron it out. Yes, it is stressful, but it is stressful for other people. Some other colleagues might have problems. I'm okay. I'm a very cavalier attitude to it. And I find that quite interesting, because also the training that they receive and the support that they receive absolutely does not match the amount of moral stressors that they encounter on an everyday basis. So they are really very exposed.
So do they talk at all about managing any of that collectively? Because one of the other things I've always been a little bit surprised about in my work with staff, whether that's in custody or in the deportation project, is that they tell me that they don't socialize outside work. And so my understanding of earlier literature on the police and on prison officers was that people very rarely avail themselves of the formal kind of channels for managing difficult aspects of their job, but they have a relatively strong informal kind of network, going to the pub and talking things, maybe not even talking things through, but kind of being together and bantering and stuff. And that doesn't seem to be part of the quality of the working lives of the people who I've done work on it. What is it like with your lot?
So I did some work in the National Command and Control Unit, which is a control room of immigration enforcement, and it's a unit that is kind of centralize the communications within immigration enforcement, and formed by immigration officers and chief immigration officers, and so officers who are trained as immigration officers. And there, it was really surprising, and perhaps it is because it is chaired by a woman. I don't know if that there is a gender dimension to it. But so they have a lot of activities around well-being, mental health, kind of semi-institutionalized. The paradox is that, of course, these people are working from the office, right? And they receive calls. So basically, it is a call center. So they don't have the dilemmas that operational staff, very real dilemmas that operational staff face on an everyday basis when doing their work. In the ICE team, so the immigration and compliance, immigration compliance and enforcement teams, and where that's the kind of the enforcement arm of immigration enforcement, where I did most of my observations. That is very much left to staff to deal with. There's a number of charities that they are signposted to, and there's in the offices there are notices about hinting at the importance of these issues for their work, but there is no formal training, and there's no formal support for officers, and because the pattern, the shift patterns of operational staff is bizarre. Really, it's kind of it is very difficult to navigate for individuals in kind of the work-life balance. So they have shifts starting at 4 o'clock in the morning, or at 12 o'clock in the evening, during weekends, and the team is very small, so it means that officers have different shifts all across the week. So my understanding is that kind of perhaps it is not an intentional and deliberate outcome, but this prevents officers to socialize, and to have that kind of binding together.
Okay, so my last question, because we're supposed to keep these videos short, is do you ever worry, or have you ever been challenged? Do you ever worry about kind of focusing on staff who are engaged in immigration enforcement, that in telling their stories and particularly in this issue, in concentrating on the kind of emotional difficulties that some of them face, do you ever worry that overrides some of that in itself kind of might iron out some of the moral and political controversies? Do you ever worry that you might either become or be seen to be becoming sort of sympathetic to one side of the process and overlooking the people who are being arrested and then forcibly removed?
Yeah, absolutely. So my research is very much focusing on institutional actors, so police and immigration staff. Yes, I have that fear. I have that fear of kind of humanizing immigration, the risk of humanizing immigration officers to the detriment of obscuring the immense harm that they cause. In particular with when I was writing this piece on the moral pains of immigration control, border controls, I think though that that's kind of that dichotomy is a false dichotomy, because and this is what I've been trying to do with my work of immigration work, not in a deliberate way at the beginning, but then starting to kind of understand the role of these officers, why they are there, what are their motivations, what is it like to be an immigration officer, and tapping into, of course, without kind of romanticizing or without completely obscure the harm that they produce, but also tapping into the contradictions, the ambivalences, the moments of reckoning, the moments of doubts that they express during field work, both in interviews and in their everyday work, and reflect on what those kind of sort of moments that there's a lot of contradictions, because in one particular instance you have a very tough stance, very punitive stance towards someone, and then at exactly the next moment you have a recognition of the pains that being an immigration officer can generate in a particular individual. So I try to make sense of that, and I try to make sense of kind of that double, there's no horrible people and nice people. We are all very complicated moral beings, and they are too. And in a sense, I try to de-exorcise these officers that I perceive as, bad people, generally, and are painted in that way. Yes, and I think that's kind of that approach, that viewpoint, help us generate critique from a different vantage point, which is also very important, is the vantage point of the people who are tasked with this work that in some ways is very dirty work.
Okay, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you very much, Anna. That was super interesting.
Thank you.